Welcome to the Dark Mind Podcast. Friends and familiars, thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Dark Mind Podcast, where we explore the boundless realm of dark literature and film. On today's show, we have a writer known for his gripping storytelling and innovative game designs. He's joining me today to discuss his recent work entitled Everything is Temporary, as well as his previous work, Slashtag and the Island Mother. So without further ado, join me as we delve into the dark insight of Jon Cohn. Jon, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining me on this 24th day of January 2024. I came across your work through a recommendation from Andrew Nyberg, who sang your praises from the rooftop. And having read Andrew Nyberg's amazing work, I thought that if he found your work incredible, it must be really good. So I was not surprised when I checked out your latest work, Everything is Temporary. The story was an immersive experience that delved deep into existential issues, featured a horrific supernatural antagonist, and presented a unique form of epistolary fiction. So I'm thrilled to have you on the show to discuss this masterful work.
I'm excited to be here, Vincent. Thank you. And I got to agree that Andrew Nyberg is an incredible author that everyone should read. I'll just go straight in with a plug for someone else.
Yeah. Andrew Nyberg, shout out. But your book is told from the perspective of a woman named Sarah, who has a husband named Tom and a daughter named Emma. The story begins when Emma's best friend Maya, who is terminally ill, passes away in her sleep. They do their best to console Emma, but as time passes, Emma's grief turns into acting out at school. Eventually, she does something that nearly gets her in trouble with the law. However, as they are dealing with the fallout from Emma's latest incident, they pass an old man on an escalator. Tom not only recognizes him, but also recoils from him in absolute terror. Following this encounter, Tom's behavior and mental state deteriorate significantly, marking the true beginning of the story. So, this is a great work of speculative fiction featuring the supernatural elements of the antagonist. It also incorporates very real aspects of life, such as grief and the temporary nature of not only life, but basically everything, hence the title, Everything is Temporary. These existential elements are staples of Gothic fiction, so I was wondering if you're a fan of Gothic fiction, and if so, were there any particular influences for this book?
I am a fan of Gothic fiction. I would say that for me, it's more about the character than it is about the story necessarily. If a story and the characters warrant, I think, a long form buildup, if it's a slow build to a big payoff at the end, as long as I'm with the characters, I'm along for the journey, whether that's dark Gothic or if it's fast paced, something that's coming at you fast and hard. It really comes down to characters, how much I believe them, how much I want to follow their story. And I would say that it does lean a little bit towards Gothic fiction in that sense, that we're very much focused on the character's journey.
Yes, but it also, as we'll get into it, the fantastical elements you add to this story. I mean, if you look at the cover, I remember seeing it going, that is bizarre. And you're reading the story, you're like, oh yeah, the story is bizarre.
Yeah, it's a little out there. And I will say, for anybody who looks at the cover and thinks, hey, this is a book that should only be read at Christmas, it is actually not set during Christmas time. For anybody who's enjoyed books like Joe Hill's Nosferatu, I think anyone would agree that while there are certain Christmas elements in that story, it's not specifically a Christmas book. That's very similarly what I set out to achieve with Everything is Temporary. There certainly are a lot of Christmas elements present, but it is not what I would necessarily call a Christmas story.
I am having like post-traumatic stress disorder right now, flashbacks from dealing with the guys that I work with about whether Die Hard is a Christmas movie or not.
See, I always make the argument, but it's with Gremlins. I'm always saying Gremlins is a Christmas movie. I only watch it at Christmas time. But, you know, there are other movies, there are other books that are set during Christmas that aren't necessarily a Christmas piece of fiction. It just depends, right?
And personally, I don't know what it is. I just think Christmas lights are very pleasant and nice, but they can also really accentuate and elevate the tension in a horror story for some reason. I don't know why. I guess it's kind of surreal, you know, just these colored lights.
You know, there's a reason why Freddy Krueger's sweater is red and green.
Oh, yeah.
They picked it specifically because they are the two hardest colors for your eyes to reconcile when next to each other. So it was a more difficult, and it made it harder to see. And I think that's kind of funny because we use that as something as kind of a horror element for Freddy Krueger. And yet during Christmas time, it's something that is celebrated and really gets people excited. And just like horror and comedy or anything, you know, you can take something that feels one way so specifically and put it in a different context. And all of a sudden it takes on a new shape and a new form.
So I know there's a lot, and we'll get back on track on the book here. I'm just going off into the weeds. You mentioned red and green being difficult for the eyes to reconcile. That seems odd, but there's a lot of pagan elements in the Christmas celebration. Is that pagan magic?
It certainly could be. I read Krampus recently by Brom, and that went into a deep dive into, you know, the pagan roots of, you know, the Christmas holiday, or Yuletide, as it's said in there. There are so many elements that are stolen and turned into Christmas. Who knows where the red and green came from? But I'm glad it's there because they're two of my favorite colors.
Nice. Well, the reader is privy to Sarah's continuous stress-filled monologue throughout the story, which intensifies as Tom's mental state deteriorates. This stress stems not only from the fear and horror of what is happening to her family, but also from the loss of her professional career. What is the impact of Sarah losing her professional career? How does this loss intertwine with the other stresses she faces, and how does it affect her identity and actions?
Yeah, it's a great question. Originally, actually, her professional career was a larger part of the story, and I ended up cutting quite a bit of it because the point of it was to show that she was a self-made woman, that she was in many ways professionally the opposite of her husband, Tom. He is an idealist. He's a painter. She's a realist. She has to know everything that's going on in her business. When you're the CEO of a small company, you have to know literally everything that's going on at all times. And so when we put her in a situation in which her husband is acting increasingly erratically, this is family. This is the person that you're supposed to trust the most, and it's the person you love the most. And when you don't have access to knowing all the information, when you are all of a sudden in a situation where you don't know what to believe, you don't know what to trust, I think it heightens that character's experience, whether it's anxiety, fear, or mistrust. And I think the other thing is that when you have someone that you love and they're going through a really hard time, sometimes you have to make sacrifices, you have to make hard decisions, and you don't necessarily want to bog your partner down with it. You don't want to hurt their feelings. You don't want to upset them. And so Sarah has to make a very difficult choice fairly early in the book when trying to figure out how to pay her husband's legal fees. And she has to make the hard decision to close down her own business. But she doesn't rub it in his face. She's not telling him and running to tell him anything. She's trying to hide it as much as she can because she's just trying to be supportive of her husband. And she doesn't want him to feel guilty, doesn't want to pile on where she doesn't feel it's necessary, even to her own mental detriment, which I think is something a lot of people can understand and kind of get behind. We never want to hurt the people we love, even if we have to do something that hurts us in order to do it.
Yeah, and that last part of the sentence, things can get really messy in those particular situations. Very realistic element to the story, which I liked. So Sarah's monologue is a key element in the book. What techniques did you use to ensure that her internal dialogue remained engaging throughout the story?
Mostly, I'm just an incredibly anxious person. That's mostly just me. If you read some of my other books, you'll find that focus on character and their internal monologue is present in pretty much everything I write. Like I said before, I approach writing character first, and I really want to know how a character would react in a situation, how they'd behave in a situation. Before I was a writer, I come from a background of being a board game designer for 10 years. I worked in film industry for a small time. But even before that, I've been a dungeon master in Dungeons and Dragons ever since I was like 12 years old. And so my process for building characters for books, for games, for really anything I do, my process is the same. And it's a little weird because it's how I've been building Dungeons and Dragons campaigns for decades now, which is that I do an intense amount of world building. I do an intense amount of character building to make sure that I know exactly what the world is, what the people are, how they react in that world. And then I can sort of drop them into a sandbox and see how they behave. And since I already know the world, I know the characters, the story, I don't want to say the story writes itself because it's still a ton of hard work, but the story is easier to find when you know your characters and you know your world.
Yeah, definitely. Well, switching over to Tom, but still from Sarah's perspective, how did you approach depicting the deterioration of Tom's mental state through Sarah's perspective?
Sure. So, I love an unreliable narrator. And in this book, I kind of had my cake and ate it too, where I ended up having a book within a book that Tom had written. So we do eventually go into his perspective. But
brilliant, by the way.
Oh, thank you. But as an adult in the primary story, or I call it like the prime timeline, I really felt that it was Sarah's story to uncover. I think if we had Tom's perspective as the lead character, you'd be asking different questions as a reader as you went through. And so by having Sarah be our primary character, she's kind of our audience. She's with us on the journey on our prime timeline. And then as we're getting pieces of this story, this book that Tom has written from his perspective, it really stands as a juxtaposition between the two so that the reader can kind of always be questioning, but also be learning about both characters as they make their way through the book.
Gotcha. Well, as we've alluded to already in the story, Sarah is the CEO of her own marketing company, and Tom is a painter, very much an idealist. However, they have personality profiles that differ from those typically associated with their respective jobs. I suppose within the job itself, I'm sure when she's CEOing, for lack of a better word, she's probably all over her staff. I'm sure she's fair, but I'm sure she's firm and very much in control. And the same with Tom when he's producing art. I'm sure he's very much in the emotional flow. And while Tom is very sensitive and empathetic, he's also quite stoic and is referred to by Sarah as her rock in rough times. And Sarah, on the other hand, is assertive, probably more so at work, but at least within the family, I wouldn't categorize her as the aggressive alpha female type that's often found in CEOs. How were their respective occupations and temperaments meant to drive the story forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for me, I think it comes down to the common trait is that they both are incredibly passionate people and they both have an incredible amount of love for each other and their daughter. And they also have a tremendous amount of respect for each other and for each other's temperaments and each other's boundaries. And so I think that when you have someone who's a CEO, that is a personality type, but when she comes home, she understands that more or less puts her into the disciplinarian role as a family member, as a mother, whereas the father is a little bit more of the lenient guy. He's the friend. And so when we have a point in the story where there's this shift in Tom and he starts becoming erratic behavior and he gets arrested and goes to jail for a crime that he's been alleged to commit, we kind of have this inversion of what the characters need to be. Tom suddenly becomes the person who can't handle stress, who is flying off the handle. And Sarah has to become the one who is essentially acting as a single parent to the daughter. She has to be the daughter's rock at that point. And so we kind of set up in the beginning that she's not the one who's good at necessarily consoling the daughter. She's not necessarily the one who's good at having a great relationship friendly wise with the daughter, but she is the person who lays down the law. And so for her to have to both be laying down the law and thinking about how am I going to make my daughter get through this without traumatizing her worse than it already is, without hurting her, without, messing her up. Those were all things that she initially left up for Tom to do. And when she loses that, she has to try and kind of find a different part of herself and still retain all of those other things. So it just adds to the stress of the character, I think.
Well, Emma narrowly avoids trouble with the law, but Tom actually ends up getting in significant legal trouble. And as a result, the family faces not only the threat of a supernatural antagonist, but also the possibility of Tom being sent to prison for a very long time. So is the juxtaposition of real and supernatural threats intentional? And if so, is it a device that you've used in your other books? And can you expand on that?
It absolutely is a device I've used in my other books. My first novel, The Island Mother, was all about Hawaiian folklore and the gods of Hawaiian folklore. I like to do a lot of research into my stories to have kernels of truth within history that I can bring in. Also, I just grew up watching a lot of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And in that show, monsters were metaphors for the problems that people face in life. And in that show, initially, it was being a teenager in high school. But it's a theme that's resonated with me throughout my life. It's something that works its way into pretty much everything that I write. That from a writer's perspective, it's cathartic for me to be able to take things from my life that, I maybe don't feel so great about, or things that I've had to deal with, and to create an actual supernatural monster that's killable in a book, or that can be fought in a book that, sort of helps to get myself through those things. Very much the writing process for me is just as much a form of therapy as it is creating fiction.
And just kind of a side note, I feel like I read, maybe it was in your bio, that you and your wife, when you met, you kind of connected over Buffy the Vampire Slayer somehow.
We did. So we got set up. We got set up on a blind date. Yeah. My dad and a woman that worked at his bank, they had a conversation that, hey, both of our children are nerdy. That means they're a great fit. And I was like, that's not how this works. And then we went on a blind date, and like 6 hours later, after we'd been sitting for coffee and talked about Buffy for 6 hours, it was like, okay, so it might be actually how this works. So yeah, Buffy's been a huge influence on almost everything I've written, as well as, a lot of other authors, a lot of other influences. Almost everything I write is an homage to something in some way, and everything is temporary. There's certainly homages to Nosferatu, Joe Hill book. There's some definite references to It, Stephen King. And then, of course, a ton of references to some of my favorite horror movies like Home Alone and A Christmas Story, Miracle on 34th Street. I think anybody who's read those books or seen those movies will certainly understand and find the references as they read.
Nice. Well, circling back to the book, the defense lawyer Sarah hired to represent Tom, Eric Walsh, had a very interesting demeanor. Even when Tom discussed actions and beliefs that would make the average person think he was crazy, Walsh listened very objectively and did not seem to be trying to piece together any kind of insanity plea at any point. So, did you give the lawyer this objectivity to allow the full scale of the story to unravel for the reader in sort of the guise of disclosure to his lawyer? Or was there a different reason? And can you expand on this element of the story?
So it ended up actually mostly being a convenience because, like I said, I do a lot of research.
Mm-hmm.
I have a friend of a friend who is an assistant district attorney of Los Angeles. And
wow.
He was a huge help in this because I didn't know the first thing about crimes. I mean, the most I know about the legal justice system is watching Law and Order and reading Lincoln Lawyer books, which actually was really helpful because I learned through reading the Lincoln Lawyer books that gavels have not been used in California since 2010. And I was like, oh, okay,
really?
Let me pull that. No, I talked to this ADA for a lot. Boy, if he had charged me, I would be on the streets by now for all the time that he spent talking to me about this book. But truly, everything that he said to me was kind of gold for a writer's perspective, because he did say a lot of these things that, even though he's a prosecutor, a defense attorney does generally want to try to reserve judgment on their client. And so while the evidence itself is overwhelming, and that's kind of something that we get out of the way very quickly, is that there's a lot of evidence against this guy, I wanted to focus more on trying to understand where he's coming from and trying to build a defense around that. So having that character be a little bit more open, it was helpful. But according to my ADA friend, it was also somewhat realistic, which is just a cherry on top.
Nice.
I'd also just love to maybe sometime revisit that lawyer character. And if he's got a bit of an open mind, then there's all sorts of directions that we could take him somewhere in the future. So There's a little bit of leaving a door open there, but I was fairly surprised at just how open a lot of defense lawyers are when trying to find what the defense angle is in the process.
Yeah, and I think it stems from the first novel I ever read was The Client by John Grisham. And, he's not my cup of tea these days, but I think his fiction's amazing. I would still read him. It's just I've got so much other stuff that I'm really interested in. But I don't know what it is. For some reason, I really love the scrupulous realism of the legal system in a fictional story. I don't know why. It's compelling to me.
It is. And I go back to the Lincoln Lawyer because I actually read all the books as research for this one because, again, with my ADA friend, he told me if you're going to read any legal books, like law fiction books, Lincoln Lawyer is the closest to fact, to actual reality from a legal standpoint of any series that he knows of. So when I was reading those books, the author does such a fantastic job educating you just enough to be interested in what they're talking about in the law, but not going so deep that your eyes glaze over and you go, I don't know. This is all legalese. It's all Greek to me at a certain point. But he does it in a way that's so good, that's so straightforward, and just really kind of, it sucks you in and you're like, oh, so this is how this works. Mm-hmm. I really appreciated that. And I tore through all the Lincoln Lawyer books in like a week and a half. And so I was like, okay, well, if this was this interesting to me, and I don't read a lot of fiction that's outside of sort of my wheelhouse of, horror and sci-fi fantasy. I read a lot of genre fiction. So law procedural fiction was kind of outside of my comfort zone, but boy, did I tear through them because again, it came down to characters, really, really good, compelling characters. And then a story that was told, I think, in a way that was really easy for an audience to understand, even though it was about some complex topics.
Yeah. Well, a significant part of the story is presented as, and I think I'm labeling it correctly, as epistolary fiction. I know epistolary fiction is kind of tantamount to found footage. And in your story, it's not necessarily found per se. I mean, they're led to it. They're told it exists and told to read it, but at the same time, not really told why, other than it's going to help them understand. So it's basically Tom, the artist, writes a book. And although it reads like supernatural fiction, it's actually based on real events. And at a certain point, the narrative begins to alternate between the main story and the narrative of Tom's book. Absolutely brilliant. Just saying. There are also some found artifacts. So what was the creative process behind intertwining the narratives of the main story and Tom's book? How did you ensure a seamless transition between the two?
Yeah, I think, again, it goes back to my deep love of it. That book bounced back and forth between a story where children are dealing with something really terrifying and supernatural, and then adults who have a much more grounded, realistic take on it. And I wanted to sort of take that adult story and really push it to the next level of realism, where we don't know if the monster's real. And there's no question that Pennywise is real when they're adults. In this book, that's not the case. But for the kids' story, I really wanted to have that sense of everything is heightened, everything is bigger, everything is scarier, everything means more when you're a child. And also, because it's through the eyes of a child, there's a lot of things that we can sort of establish and then turn on its head later, because you're dealing with somebody who wrote something 20 years ago. And that's very different. In 20 years, we can become very different people.
Yeah. Well, the narrative layers in your book are perfectly balanced for readability, but I have read books in the past that were so complex I had a hard time keeping up. How important do you think readability is in comparison to the complexity of a story, especially in speculative fiction? Do you think it's acceptable to make the story a little laborious to read as long as the complexity makes it more compelling?
It's a great question, and it's one I'm not sure I necessarily have a great answer for. I'll start to sound like a broken record here, but if the characters and the plot make the story feel like it deserves to be complex, then I'm along for the ride. Mm-hmm. If we're adding complexity for the sake of complexity, what's the point? Like I said earlier, I cut a significant amount of the time that we spend with Sarah at her job, because in the end, I felt that it didn't contribute enough to her story. I think that we understood enough who she was and what her situation was by getting the scenes that we did at her job. But we didn't need to know every little detail about what she did. We didn't need to know, the minutia of the legal system, right, of this. We just needed to know every piece that was important for the story and then move on. So I do know that sometimes books can get a little bogged down for me with trying to over-describe things or trying to add too many layers of complexity if I don't feel it's necessary. Why tell a book with 100,000 words when you can tell the exact same story with the exact same punch with 80,000 words or 60,000 words? I don't think that there's any merit to making something long for the sake of long. I don't think there's merit to making something complex for the sake of complex.
Yeah. Well, the book written by Tom, in your book, Everything is Temporary, is also titled Everything is Temporary. This book is very meta in the sense that it not only shares the title of your book, but it also parallels the narrative telling the story of Tom's childhood as you narrate the story of his adulthood. Or I guess I should say Sarah narrates the story of his adulthood. This is another example of how you managed to handle a concept that could easily become convoluted and confusing for the reader, yet you kept it easy to follow and very compelling. Can you tell us about your process of organization? Are you a meticulous outliner, or do you prefer to write spontaneously and rely on rewrites and editing? Or are you just one of those writers who can spontaneously craft a coherent and complex narrative that comes together perfectly and organically as it's dropped in your lap from the one true God?
Boy, do I wish. No, I am an intense outliner. I spend months writing all of my characters, their backstories, their loves, their dislikes, what tattoos they have, why they got those tattoos. I think all of those things help me in understanding them so that when we go into the story, I know how they'll behave. I know how they'll react. And again, just building that world out. I don't know how to do it any other way because I've been doing it like this, building Dungeons and Dragons campaigns since I was 15. So I approach books the exact same way that I approach D&D. It's the same way I approach board game design. It's all about trying to create that initial core experience and then have everything sort of come from that. With everything is temporary, there was a little bit of I guess you could say an inciting incident regarding the plot that made me want to write it. About 10 years ago, maybe a little more, I was working a job that I had a lot of free time to walk around the neighborhood. I had these weird long breaks. I was working at a theater. And I came across a house that was called the Christmas House. And it had a sign that said, Christmas House, come on in. And I thought, gosh, I'm either about to die or get a great story. And I'm really thankful that it was the latter. But it's been sitting in my head. This one scene had been sitting in my head for about 10 years before I finally sat down to write this book. And really, the reason I sat down to write the book was that I finally figured out the characters. For me, I couldn't justify writing an entire book based around one scene or one idea. I needed to have the cast that would make it worthwhile. And when I figured out that kind of idea of a story within a story, when I figured out, the sort of relationship between Sarah and her husband, then all of a sudden pieces started coming together. And I was like, oh, now I have something. Now I can actually start planning this out.
And I may have missed it. I heard you say very almost like dossiers of characters and world building and an inspiration as far as the Christmas House, but as far as the plot, the progression, is that also meticulously outlined, or is a certain amount of that spontaneous?
So it depends on the book. For this one, I really had to have the plot nailed down because there were so many pieces in the two different storylines that needed to come together at certain points in time in the story for them to make sense. I really wanted to make sure that something that was introduced in the book within a book would actually get paid off fairly quickly before the reader would forget about it or would say, I don't understand what's going on, right? The last thing that I want to have is somebody going, I'm so lost, right? I don't know what's going on. And so for this book, because there was a lot going on, because we're dealing with characters who, Tom is Tom in the main timeline, but he's renamed himself Tim in the book. And so you're like, okay, we're changing names, but we're changing them so slightly that hopefully the readers catch it pretty darn quickly. He's got a bully named Larry. When we're an adult, it turns out the guy's name is Terry. So there's little things like that, but there's also, a lot of the bigger things that I wanted Sarah to be learning throughout this process, that I wanted us to be learning about Tom, to keep the reader maybe guessing, but also thinking that they know what's going on, and then quickly changing that and saying, well, maybe you don't know what's going on, but always having a theory, right? I hate for you to be in a situation where you're like, I have no idea what's going on and I have no theories. I love it when you get to a point where you're like, I have 5 theories, that's what I love. Is when someone's like, I have 6 different ideas of what's going to happen here, and they're all viable. That to me is like the top of the pops. That's the best storytelling, is when you're not left questioning what could possibly happen, but you're sitting there questioning, like, I think these 6 things could possibly happen. And then when you're thrown for that loop, when a 7th thing that you totally didn't plan for happens, and you're like, whoa, but also, now that I think back, that makes sense. That's the absolute best. So that's what I was going for. I'll let the readers decide how successful I was at it. But that was the goal.
And it was a very nice touch. Obviously, you don't really understand until you get into the book. But the first thing you see on the cover is, I think it says by Tom Barnes or written by Tom Barnes, one of the two.
Yeah.
Crossed out Jon Cohn. Like, okay, what the hell is this? Very good indication of your brand of humor. Like, I think you and your wife are probably hell on wheels to hang out with. Hilarious.
I do love to have these kind of little nods. I mean, the book is full of nods and references to all of my favorite things. And some of them are going to smack you in the head. Like, there's some very overt Home Alone references, but there's also some references to like A Christmas Story that are maybe a little less overt. For instance, in the book within the book, in Tom's story of Everything is Temporary, he only ever refers to his father as his old man. All fathers are referred to as the old man. And that's because in A Christmas Story, the main character, Ralphie, only ever calls his father his old man. And so, even things like that, that was a very deliberate choice in the book. And it also helps to differentiate between those two storylines again, because Sarah doesn't have that context. Sarah isn't thinking of people as my old man. She's referring to people as a father. And so it just adds that kind of extra layer that I think is fun. And then, of course, there is the fact that the cover of the book is the actual cover of the book in the book. When they describe the cover of the book, it is the book you're holding. So the reason that Tom's name is there on the cover is because Tom's name is on the cover. And the book is, the cover's been made to look distressed, like it is something that's 20 years old that just got found in an old cardboard box that someone pulled out. I really wanted it to look like the book that exists in the world, because I just think it's a fun Easter egg, right?
Yeah, that book gets so meta. Were there any times where you're just writing by yourself? You're like, oh God, wait a minute. What am I doing? Who am I?
Yeah, I kind of got that out with my previous novel, Slashtag. Slashtag was the most overt love letter to horror films. So in that book, the briefest synopsis is that a bunch of celebrities sign up to go on an extremely haunted horror reality competition series. It's like Survivor meets Cabin in the Woods, but they're inside of a super haunted version of H.H. Holmes's Murder House. But the main character in that story is secretly a massive horror movie fan. And so when they keep finding themselves in these kind of horror movie-ish situations in the book, the main character's like, well, I know what happens in Scream when this happens, so I'm going to behave in this way. Or I know what would happen in Child's Play, right? So in that book, I very overtly was talking about my references and my inspirations, because it was part of the character's trait was that she was an obsessed horror fan, which I am also an obsessed horror fan. So, again, it's easier for me to write deep in a character's perspective because I am those characters. I am those people. I'm very anxious. I also can't stop thinking about horror movies and books and the things that I loved when I was a kid, and how to take the elements that I loved from those things and to turn them into something new that has my own sort of signature on it.
Yeah. Well, you kind of gave us insight into the inspiration of the Christmas house, but to kind of explain a little bit more, there is this house that appears to not only be a beacon of Christmas magic, but also a symbol of love and hope for terminally ill children. The magical house, along with the sweet old lady name, is it Mrs. Claus?
Yes.
Okay. Just making
Sandra
sure you weren't.
Claus.
Oh, you went there. Okay. Gotcha. Sandra Claus, who lives in and runs it, is every child's dream. However, as you come to find out, the house and the woman are anything but benevolent, and it reaches a point where the smell of freshly baked cookies becomes an ominous sign. So tell me about the process of taking something so happy and innocent and gradually infusing it with a sense of creeping dread until it fully transforms into pure terror. And one of the examples is Mrs. Claus routinely keeps the most popular toys out for kids, like a supply of them. And this particular girl, our main character, knows that she wants this particular thing.
Yeah, he's basically working as her helper elf. And she always tells people, she says, little elf, can you run to the back and get, the latest Nintendo or, the whatever it is. In this instance, the little girl wanted a Tamagotchi.
And what's so creepy is she just gives him a look like, no, you give her something else. And he's like, but she's like, no, just this subtle shift from being this benevolent, magical, it's Mrs. Claus, Sandra Claus, to all of a sudden just being a little disagreeable. It injects this creeping sense of dread that starts very small, and then you just kind of pile on things slightly worse, slightly worse, slightly worse until it's full on terrifying.
Yeah. In Tom's book, he's dealing with these things that just keep mounting and mounting. That whole thing came from, again, my real experience at a Christmas house. or at the Christmas house. I doubt that there are many.
Did it smell like fresh baked cookies?
It sure did. So the real story here is that I walked into this house because there was a sign that told me to, and I'm dumb. So I walked in and I met this guy. At first, he seemed really nice. He was really nice. I don't want to defame this person and make him sound like he's a nightmare person, because he wasn't. He was lovely. He was nice, but he was also a deeply troubled person. And so I came in there and he's saying, I run this Christmas house. Anyone is welcome into my house to celebrate Christmas at any time of the year. And I was like, that's so cool. I love Christmas. I celebrate Halloween all year. I keep my house spooky all year. So that's cool. But then he started talking about how he works with terminally ill children. And he showed me a CD and he played me some songs that he'd written about the transition to death for children. And like, as this went on and on, I kept feeling, more and more like, oh, this is really sad. This isn't just like this little happy place. This is a place that is legitimately, it's like sad things happen. And then the more I talked to him as well and got to know the person, it got sadder. I was working in an area of San Diego called Hillcrest, which is a predominantly proud gay neighborhood. And he told me that he was an openly gay Mormon who had been exiled from his community and decided that he was going to live a full life of abstinence because he was so devout in his belief in Mormonism that he would never pursue a romantic relationship. And yet he lived in the safe haven gay community of San Diego. And so, I just kept thinking, I felt so bad that this guy felt so ashamed of living his life the way that he meant to, the way that he wanted to, that he channeled all of these feelings of guilt and whatever else, he must have been feeling, and channeled it into focusing on dying children. It was just really sad. And so eventually I thought, there's got to be a way to turn this into a horror story that's not just like incredibly depressing. And I think I managed it by threading in this storyline that is the kid's storyline. That's Tom's book, that is bonkers and wild and bombastic, because I think otherwise you risk moving into an area where this isn't a fun, happy, quick read. This could get dark, actually dark, like sad dark. And I didn't want it to move that deep into that territory. I mean, again, it wasn't until I figured out my characters and I kind of figured out what the real story I wanted to tell was, that I figured out how to take that experience and turn it into something that still retained the core of what I experienced talking to him, but also took it in a different direction that fit what I know how to write, which is horror.
So this was an actual place that for dying children.
Yeah.
Sort of like a Make-A-Wish Foundation if your last wish is to have Christmas one more time.
Yeah. He certainly didn't have a program to the degree that I had set up for Mrs. Claus in this book, but he said that he regularly had terminally ill children come over and he would bake them cookies and show them One Last Christmas and then sing songs about dying to them. And I was just like, whoa, this is a lot to take in. And what started out as just this kind of, I'm walking into this winter wonderland, maybe I'm going to die. But quickly became me feeling like really sad. And sad for this person and sad for the whole situation. And I never really stopped thinking about, gosh, there are people out there who are never going to see another Christmas. And I don't know, it was a real bummer. I'm turning this podcast into a real sad conversation.
Well, I mean, it's the Dark Mind podcast, not the fluffy, airy mind podcast. I have had people like that in my life that for one reason or the other experience a lot of shame, usually unnecessarily, like in this man's case. I mean, just feeling shame for being gay just because his religion tells him that it's wrong. It seems like when people are really overtaken by shame, that they will tend to do something spiritually good, which, what could be more spiritually good than helping dying children in their last days, feel good, experience something great. But at the same time, it seems like there's almost this impetus that because they feel so much shame, whatever they do has to be something really difficult and really painful. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
it's almost
absolutely.
like a masochistic thing. I'm not trying to say anything about, dealing with dying kids as being bad, but I mean, obviously it's a horrific thing to have to face, meet sweet little children. And then you hear like a couple of weeks, yeah, they passed away,
Yeah.
So
I will say, it was a challenge to work elements like that into a story that also has some feel-good Christmas elements, that has some really wild elements in Tom's storyline. Because it's so deep into his perspective and because we really don't know what's fact or fiction in his story goes so crazy that when we keep going back to the real world, I think that it helps to keep us from really feeling too sad because we always have that balance. We always have the other side of that. And again, I always go back to the Buffy well because it informs like 90% of decisions when I'm like, what do I do? And in Buffy, the saddest, hardest, most depressing episodes usually are punctuated with some of the funniest moments. And I think that striking a balance between dark and light is very important.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you revel too deeply in the darkness, I think that you can lose your audience. I think that you can create something that ends up being a feel-bad experience. And of course, I'm writing horror here, and the whole point is to write something that's upsetting to a degree, but like, I'm also not going out to actually upset people, right? I'm not going into this being like, hey, here's some trigger warnings, right? Like, I don't want to be like, hey, let me trigger everybody that's reading this book. But I also understand that a major part of this, and I couldn't find a way around it, a major part of this was about everything is temporary. Everything is temporary. And unfortunately, sometimes that means lives that cut out too soon.
Yeah. So I'm hearing well-placed comedic palate cleansers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was the goal.
Emotional palate cleansers.
Right. And I think that's what those chapters really served a lot of, was providing the reader with some relief and providing the reader with a new direction to kind of focus on so that we never went too deep down one rabbit hole that might get too upsetting.
Yeah. Well, Mrs. Claus, who is an extremely powerful adversary, has a lot of minions under her control. And this is, of course, according to this book that was looked up, each with varying levels of power to harm Tom and those who are trying to help him. And these minions are staples of Christmas decor, and much like the usually pleasant smell of freshly baked cookies, they take on a very ominous sight. So, aside from the Christmas tree, what inspired your particular choice of Christmas decor, and what inspired their powers and limitations? Because I know from what you said previously that you must have some very detailed dossiers on these characters, what they're capable of, what laws they're subject to and not subject to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, who hasn't sucked on a candy cane until it's gotten a really sharp tip? And then you can stab someone with it. And then the candy cane breaks and everything's fine. But, a candy cane can be a weapon. Now, that was one of the first things I thought about when I was coming up with the army of living Christmas decorations. Aside from evergreen, the British evil tree. So we had candy canes, we had nutcrackers. They were a little bit of low-hanging fruit because you could give a bunch of them little tiny rifles. And then you've got these guys, these little like 6-inch guys shooting these little tiny, like less than a millimeter bullets. And it's like, well, that's not going to kill anyone. That's not going to seriously injure anyone. But if you're 11 and a 6-inch tall action figure is shooting tiny guns at you, that's really scary. And it can become more dangerous. And I think that was one big thing, was we're looking at all of these things from two different perspectives. We're looking at it from the adult's perspective, which is A, this doesn't make sense. No, this isn't how the world works. And B, even if it was, what kind of threat could this actually be? Not really. But to a 12-year-old, it's a completely different world. And so, yeah, I think that a lot of the things in there, we're looking at Christmas decorations that we don't normally see as something scary. And even as adults probably don't see as scary, but to a child might be very scary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, kind of like death by 1,000 paper cuts, those little rifles.
Right? There's also a bunch of living Hummels, the little ceramic figurines. And I'll just tell you right now, those things have creeped me out ever since I was a kid. You never go to someone's house and you see one. No one ever has one.
Yeah.
People either have none or 1,000.
I meant to actually look that up. I can't quite picture what a Hummel is. Let's see here.
There are these little ceramic figurines.
Yeah. Totally creepy.
And they're creepy. A lot of them, I think because a lot of them have this old world, 1800s porcelain doll aesthetic.
Mm-hmm.
And you want to talk gothic aesthetics. I think Hummels fit right in.
Yeah.
Christmas Hummels. And so, yeah, I thought they were creepy. I've always thought they were creepy. And so to have someone, and you always find them in like old people's houses too. So I was like, okay, well, this is Mrs. Claus. She's an old woman. Of course, she's got a cabinet full of 1,000 Hummels. And they had their own little personalities because, of course, they're not nutcrackers where it's an army battalion. There's a Santa Claus and there's people giving gifts and there's some elves. And, elves are supposed to be using their hammers to make toys, but sometimes they're using those hammers to smash things. There's just so many different ways that you can corrupt such innocent, wonderful things.
Uh-huh. Well, talking about corrupting innocent things, one of the main things in the book that makes Mrs. Claus a very formidable adversary is her ability to shapeshift, which not only allows her to hide, but also to psychologically terrorize people. So was her true appearance and or shape-shifting abilities inspired by any mythical beings or entities? Because of all of the quote-unquote powers, for some reason, shape-shifting seems like it's always tied to something mythical. Like
Absolutely.
And by mythical, I mean like Greek,
Right. And that's exactly what she is. In Tom's book, we have them having just finished 6th grade. I remember in 6th grade, we did a play on Greek gods and myths. And so I was thinking back to my own experiences in 6th grade, which a lot of those are in this book, by the way. The opening scene where the kid throws a handful of tacks into the fan.
I was going to ask you about that.
That happened to me. That happened regularly. When the teacher wasn't in the room, a kid would shout, "Rebel training!" And that meant you either had to duck under a table or get the heck out of there because you might get pelted in the face with the sharp end of a tack. So anyways, to get back to the question, in Greek mythology, there is a figure called Lamia who's been completely misused in a bunch of movies, like Drag Me to Hell, which is a fantastic movie, calls Lamia like a demon that's a goat person. And it's like, no, Lamia, if you look up in Greek mythology, she was a woman who had an affair with Zeus. She was a mortal person, and Hera found out, got very jealous, ripped off her eyelids, killed her children, and made it so that she could never close her eyes again. So she always had to see the crimes she committed. And then somewhere along the lines, Zeus felt bad for her and gave her more supernatural powers to shapeshift and do all of these other things. And she slowly turned into this kind of serpent woman who is often depicted as being able to pluck out her eyes and kind of hold them out and use them as kind of floating body parts. And this is all Greek mythology. And so I thought it was really appropriate. This was the Greek mythology I was learning when I was in 6th grade. And so I thought, well, hey, if I learned this in 6th grade, it makes sense for these kids to be learning this in 6th grade. And I don't think it's a major spoiler to say that the reason that Tom is freaking out as an adult is that he's dead set that this guy he saw is somehow either a form or reincarnation, a shapeshifter, somehow involved with this Mrs. Claus / Lamia creature, which maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But as children, he firmly believes all the powers that the Greek myths sort of bestow upon that figure. So there was a lot of research that went into it. There was a lot of wanting to make sure that I found the right villain. And I like my villains to be grounded in some form of mythology or storytelling. It just helps, I think, ground the story a little more.
Yeah, I just looked it up. It seems like kind of distracting. The first one that showed up was a very sexualized version. It was like this long-haired African woman with the serpent tail. I was like, oh, okay. I'm not scared anymore. But yeah, I see the other ones. So yeah, I should have just looked that up in the beginning. I should have known you would have based it on something real.
No, it's a great question, and I love talking about it. So
yeah. Well, as I just said, her appearance was very reptilian. Why do you think this particular form affects us on such a visceral level as opposed to something more wolf-like, for example?
I think there's a couple of factors there. You know, snakes shed their skin, and when you're dealing with a shapeshifter, I think there's an easy parallel to draw between snakes, which literally can grow out of themselves into other things. I mean, it's the same thing, but it's bigger. But it's the notion, right? It's that core idea of it. The other idea is that, you know, you kind of set up early that Mrs. Claus is full of warmth. The house is full of warmth. Everything makes you feel warm. The cookies, they're fresh baked. The hot chocolate, you know, everything makes you feel kind of cozy. Reptiles are cold-blooded. Reptiles, they live in cave and underground. They surface when they need to. They strike when they need to because they have to preserve their energy because they're not getting energy from a regulatory system like we do. They're cold-blooded. So to have a juxtaposition of a person that is so outwardly warm, but inwardly literally cold, again, it was just sort of icing on the cake. It wasn't necessarily something I intended when I was first coming up with the character, but the more I did research into Lamia, the more it just fit and was like, wow, okay, I can really drive this home on so many more levels than I had initially intended. Again, just by researching. Real life gave me more to work with than anything that I can make up.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of, at least for me anyway, there's a lot of connotation with snakes and evil from like the book of Genesis. But honestly, whenever I think of something reptilian that really kind of gives me the heebie-jeebies, it's more like the reptilian brain, you know, like that part of ourselves where the primate brains, the mammalian brains, none of that's involved. It's like this primal feed or breed completely, you know, like when you get really drunk, your inhibitions are gone because the reptilian brain is activated. It kind of shuts down all of that other stuff. So it kind of reminds or brings to mind that savage state where you basically don't have any moral compass is usually what comes into my head.
Absolutely. I mean, especially, again, I did a lot of research. So snakes are more or less effectively blind. They basically can't hear. Over 80% of their movements and actions are based on heat sensors that they have in their noses. And so their prey drive, their ability to hunt, their ability to function is almost entirely run on instinct. And that instinct is to kill and eat. Mm-hmm. And so you've got this Mrs. Claus. She's got some monstrous qualities to her in Tom's book. And some of that has to do with a prey drive and using those instincts in certain ways and using some of those traits in ways that are beneficial to her that you could, I think, draw some parallels, or at least you could get there with a metaphor or two to understand and correlate what's happening in the book with how snakes behave.
Yeah. Yes. But, you know, on that same token, I was just thinking about in a lot of esoteric traditions, the serpent represents wisdom. So I'm like, I'm confused.
Sure. Well, and then we're not even touching into like the Ouroboros, you know, symbol of a snake eating its own tail. There's so many different ways you can take snake mythology. I could write 5 more books about snake mythology.
Will you do that, please?
And they could be different. They could be wildly different things. Yeah, snakes are super versatile for metaphors.
Well, in the story, Sarah mentions that in regard to Tom's artwork, he paints works of magical realism. She also states that it's not uncommon to see the lights on in Tom's studio well past midnight as he works on a painting to help him work through his feelings from a childhood that he will not talk about. Why did Tom choose to write a book about his childhood instead of creating a series of paintings?
It's a great question. I think, honestly, for the same reason that I write books, it's a way of processing your trauma. It's a way of processing the things that you've gone through in your life. It's a way of communicating a message. And sometimes the way that you tell a story changes based on what the experience or the story is. I am a board game designer as well as an author, and you may not jump to the idea that like board games can be cathartic or intense storytelling experiences, but they can be. The big difference I always say between writing a book and making a board game is that when I write a book, I tell a whole story. When I make a board game, I create the scaffolding for somebody else to tell a story. And so in many ways, it all kind of comes back to the same thing, but I'm communicating certain messages through different mediums. And so for Tom, I don't think that he felt he was able to communicate everything through one medium. And he tried. The cover of the book is his own art. It is a painting of his. Everything is temporary. I don't think that he would feel like that's enough to get it out of his system. So I had him write this book instead. But it's the only book he ever wrote. It's the only thing he ever wrote. He didn't try to spread it around. He didn't try to sell it all over the place. This was something that was a deeply personal thing to him. Whereas, with paintings, it might be a little bit more commercial. We set him up as, yes, being very passionate about his work as a painter, but it's also something that's commercial that makes him money. And what we know from the book, in the book, it's always weird to say the book in the book. He didn't try to sell it. He didn't try to mass produce it. This was purely a personal experience for him that he was hoping to never have to bring out. And unfortunately finds himself in a circumstance where he feels that it's his best bet at that point in time.
Well, after reading the book and consulting with Tom's lawyer about character witnesses, Sarah goes on a trip to find and speak to Tom's friends from the book. Based on her interactions with his friends, her opinion about her husband begins to take change and the story takes a turn. So you have a talent for keeping the reader guessing, and listeners at home, this is the part of the book you get to, you'll be like, wait a minute, okay, what the hell is happening? He was talking earlier about 5 different scenarios. Well, this is the part. So I've heard that pantsing is considered the best way to achieve this effect, because if you don't have any idea where the story is going, neither will the reader. However, if you know where the story is going, you will write it in a very intentional way that the reader can follow and interpret. You told me that you are a meticulous outliner. How do you avoid this?
I mean, honestly, for me, the scenes in which Sarah went out and did her research and talked to all these people and did all of these interviews, that for me was honestly the thing I was most excited to write about, aside from, getting across my premise, which is the Christmas house. I was really looking forward to doing those scenes where she goes out and talks to people and gets these very different stories and taking pieces of those and then weaving them back into what we've learned from the book so far, what we've learned from the real world so far. That was, in my opinion, the best part to do plotting, because it was the most important section for the reader to be questioning, but questioning just enough, right? You want to give them just enough to keep being curious and keep thinking, am I right? Am I wrong? What is my gut telling me? What is my head telling me? What is evidence telling me? And do all 3 of those things line up? If not, where's the disconnect? And so all of those things were active in my mind as I was trying to write those scenes and give juxtapositions that grow kind of as a chasm as she goes from person to person. And then we go to back into the story. That's when things really start ramping up in the story within a story. So that was actually the part that I needed to plan the most. That had the most plotting there. The rest of it was, again, I don't do a ton of pantsing. The one time I tried to do pantsing, my book ended up being twice as long as I had intended. So I think the lesson learned is that I should stick with what I know. But yeah, no, that was all very intentional. That was one of the parts I was actually most excited about.
Gotcha. So the story has a somewhat bittersweet ending. And I was curious to know if there are particular elements of story endings that you despise or at the very least dislike.
Yeah. I will not mention authors' names or books' names, but
problem.
there is an author who I've read twice. Now I've read 2 of their books. And both times when the twist comes, you go, oh, okay. I kind of saw that coming. But then they spend like upwards of 50 pages explaining why the twist was clever and going back and re-explaining earlier scenes and saying, hey, did you notice what I was doing there?
Oh.
You know, kind of thing. And it's like, you got to trust your audience to a degree, right? Yes, you do have to explain the things that you're setting up. I can't open a bunch of boxes and say, you know, oh, here's this, and then not resolve any of them. But you also don't want to shut everyone so tightly that no one ever wants to open them again, right? You don't want to beat a dead horse. So I like to have, and this happens in movies too. I think it usually is the result of studio producers who don't get it and are worried that the audience won't get it. And you come to the end of the movie and then they're like, hey, here's a flashback of every important scene from the entire movie that you just watched. Remember all these scenes? And it's like, yeah, I do remember the scenes because I just watched the movie.
Yeah.
So that's the pet peeve for me when I'm reading books, is when I feel like I've reached the conclusion of the book and then I see there's another 50 pages to go and no more twists. There's no more twists coming. We're just going to explain. And I'm like, okay. I'm okay with bad endings. I'm okay with good endings. I'm okay with a sad ending. I'm okay with a bittersweet ending. As long as I feel like it's earned by the characters and by the story, I'm in.
So is the ending you're talking about, is it more of a sense of he's being narcissistic, like, look at how clever I am? Or does he just think the audience isn't intelligent enough to get it? Which I guess is kind of narcissistic itself.
Yeah. I mean, I can't speak to the mindset of other authors. You know, again, I am a very anxious person. And so I do worry a lot that I'm like not explaining things enough. And so then I'll be like, oh no, I should explain a lot of this stuff. And then I'll kind of read through it again and be like, well, maybe I'm over explaining here. Or this is where a lot of the time my absolutely lovely wife, Delaney, who's my first reader, always alpha reader, sometimes gets me to completely change a whole story because she's like, this doesn't work right here. And I'm like, oh no, you're right. So a lot of the things run through her of, is this too obvious? Is this not obvious enough? Because, you know, I've run through this story 400 times now. I know every single twist. I know exactly, you know, there's no surprises for me. So I have to have somebody else who's got a new perspective to come in and tell me, is this too obvious or is this too vague? I don't think that the author I was talking about had a person who said that to them. I don't know. Maybe they were just trying to make sure that the point got across, and they were very worried that the audience wouldn't get it. And I understand that worry. I completely understand that worry. It could also be that they just thought they were very, very clever. Who knows? All I know is I didn't like it.
Well, do you despise or dislike?
I think I despise because it can ruin stuff that came before.
Yeah.
You know, there's nothing worse. I always go back to like the Matrix movies where I'm like, boy, that first movie was so good. And I can never watch it again without knowing what happens in the other movies. And I did not like the third one. The second one was fine. Fourth one, I'm not even going to touch on. But the third one I thought was so bad that it retroactively kind of ruined the first one in some levels.
Oh, no.
You know?
Yeah, I still have good thoughts about the first one. I'm not going any further.
Yeah. And so there's movies that have done that. And there are certainly books that have done that, where the ending has gone so hard in a certain direction that I'm like, you kind of made me hate the beginning. I kind of regret reading this now when I was enjoying it up until 3/4 of the way through, 4/5 of the way through. And then we just have this extended dump of exposition or tying things together that is just unnecessary. It's like the end of the extended edition of Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, where you're like, okay, the movie's over. Oh, the movie's not over? Okay, now the movie's still not over. Oh, okay, all right. We're getting an epilogue for every single character. Okay, all right.
All right.
I mean, I love the movie, but if it's like 11 o'clock at night and you're tired and want to go to bed and you're like, I get it. They all went home. It's fine. You can just say they all went home.
Well, I may be looking at it right now. I don't know. What is your writing atmosphere?
Yeah, so I work at home. I have an office that I sit in that's incredibly nerdy.
Is this it?
This is it.
Okay.
I am in it now.
Okay.
I write everything. So some people are going to like cringe when they hear this, especially authors. I do everything in Google Docs. I do everything on Google Drive. For me, by the time I have started writing the actual book, I probably have 15 documents that are in a folder of every aspect of the world and the characters and the outlines and even like little things of tying together little pieces from one book to another or planned out other things. So I've got so many different things that I want to be able to click to and refer to. I also, sometimes I get ideas while I'm, out and about and doing things. So I always want to have access to be able to just like pop into whatever it is and like make a quick note. So I do everything in Google Docs. I like to be able to have 1,000 tabs open and just be like, okay, what do I need to know? Because that's the other thing is like when I'm writing and I'm like in a groove of something, I don't want to have a moment where I'm like, well, now I have to come up with like something new for a character. I have to come up with something new for this world because I've moved our characters into a situation that I don't know how to handle. I hate that happening because it kills my flow of writing. So if I can have all of that done, and then when the characters are like, oh, they've walked into like the mess hall of like Camp Crystal Lake, and you're just like, what's in the mess hall? I already know what's in the mess hall because I wrote it, 2 months ago. I wrote everything that happened in the mess hall. So I already know about the dead guy that's locked in the walk-in freezer. I already know about the like severed head that's sitting in the pot of like boiling mashed potatoes. I don't know why I keep going back to like Lord of the Rings references, boil them, mash them, stick them in a stew. But it's so much easier for me to just go back and reference something I've already done that I've already figured out. So yeah, my workflow is I sit in front of my computer in my office. I try to keep my dog off my back as much as possible because he's very needy. And I try to just stay in it as long as I can. Because boy, I have some bad ADHD sometimes. So if I'm not like hyper focused on something and I get pulled away, it's really hard to get back into it. Which is again, I think why I have so much prep work ahead of me done so that I can't let my distracted get away from me.
Yeah.
Like I literally can't get distracted by trying to figure something out because it's already done. So there's no excuses,
Gotcha.
John. You got to sit back down and write because you've already figured this out and you have. Any excuse, right? I'll take any excuse to step away from writing to be like, oh no, I've got to go do something. But when I give myself no excuses, that's how I get my most words done. And that's how I find my best work is when I can sit down and have an uninterrupted 3-4 hours of writing.
Nice. Well, as far as your academic/work pedigree, you attended film school, you got a BFA in film production.
Yes.
Then you worked in the film industry for a brief period of time, but then became a professional board game designer.
Yep.
You state in your bio that you began writing full-time in 2019, and your first novel, an island folk horror book that you've alluded to earlier, The Island Mother, won Publisher Weekly's 2022 Booklife Prize for Best Horror Fiction. How did it feel to receive such a prestigious prize for your first novel?
You know what? It was a roller coaster because I'm self-published. I initially tried to shop books out, but it's hard. I mean, anybody who's tried knows it's hard. Most of my queries to agents came back with 2 questions. 1, are you famous? 2, do you have any famous friends? My answer to both was no. So they said, I'm not interested. I sent books out to publishers. It goes on a slush pile and then you never see it again. So I was very excited. I didn't think I had a snowball's chance in hell to win an award like that. But the funny thing was, it did absolutely nothing for my sales. It did nothing for my sales. I'm self-published. I can look in real time online to see like how my sales are doing. You know what? It's cool to say I won an award, but it did literally nothing for me other than being able to say that I've won an award. Now I can say like, oh, award-winning writer, Jon Cohn. But like, it's so funny because, everything is temporary. Ended up doing pretty well. I'm very happy with my sales for Everything is Temporary. I'm very happy with the reception it's gotten. The book I released prior to that, Slashtag, I'm also very, very happy with. And so I get these messages online all the time on social media posts in these horror groups I'm in where people say, I have now read both of Jon Cohn's books and they're fantastic. And I always sit there like biting my nails being like, I have 3 out. The first one won an award, but it's like nobody even knows this book exists, The Island Mother. And like all the reviews, like it's my highest reviewed book. It's won this award. People don't know it exists. And it's always funny because people are like, oh yeah, I'm a fan. Like as soon as I finished Everything is Temporary, I read his other book, Slashtag. And I just want to be like, do I message them and tell them there's another one? Or do I not? I don't know what to do on that front. I don't know. It's just a weird thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at your Amazon page here. They're all well reviewed. 4.5 stars is the average. So, yeah.
Yeah. So, you know what? The nice thing about books is they're forever. A lot of the time with movies, you get like 2 months and then that's it. And then, maybe it finds life somewhere else later. But I've talked to a number of authors. I've been talking a lot with an author, Duncan Ralston, who wrote the Ghostland trilogy. It's very popular. But he wrote a novella called Womb 7 years ago. It was an extreme horror novella. And it exploded in popularity in the last 2 years. So much so that he became like a really, really huge author. And he wrote this novella 7 years ago. And I've asked him, I was like, what happened? Like, what happened that made this thing that you wrote so long blow up so big all of a sudden? He's like, I have no idea. Somebody who was like a big Instagrammer must have found it somewhere along the line and liked it and talked about it. And all of a sudden it caught fire. So, I look at my career as a marathon, not a sprint. Every book I write is me. It's a huge part of me. I don't just write things for funsies. Everything I write is a part of me. I put myself into it. And I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep doing it. I've got a 4th book coming out in a couple of months. Well, I guess I can tell what it is. We were going to release the cover in a couple of days. It's a prequel to Slashtag. It's called Try Not to Die on Slashtag. It is a choose your adventure book in the Try Not to Die series published by Mark Tullius. And it's got something like 30 different death scenes. You get to make choices. And if you make the wrong one, you die horribly. So that one is, that one's coming out in like a couple of months. And then my 5th one, I am literally, I think 2 days away from finishing my first draft. And that one I am going to be shopping around to publishers, and I'm going to try it again. Because now that I have a few books out that have really kind of taken off, I think it's time to mount that horse again and start looking for traditional publishers and do that again. I may not be able to say I'm famous, but I can say I've got 3 books out that have some pretty good reviews. So, it's a step. And at any point in my career, somebody could find any one of my books and be like, hey, I found this thing and I dug it. So, just because it didn't sell so great off the bat doesn't mean that it doesn't have a life somewhere in the future. It's all just about, it's playing the long game, right?
Absolutely. All right. So this question I have been waiting to ask the entire podcast. In your bio, you state that every year, and have been for the last 8 years, spend 3 months planning a huge murder mystery party that you've hosted, like I said, for the last 8 years. Now, when you say murder mystery party, are we talking about like Clue, like you have a dinner type thing?
No.
Okay.
No. So
tell me about this.
So I've always been a fan of murder mysteries. And when I was in high school, they had those ones where you would take it out of the box and it was like a dinner party and basically was like a table read. You had lines and people would read something and they'd be like, and now I accuse Jeffrey. And then you're like, Jeffrey, and you're like, well, I could not have done it because of this. It's like, this isn't a murder mystery. This is a table read. So years later, I found a different company called Night of Mystery. I'm plugging everyone today. Called Night of Mystery. And basically what they do is they give you an improv game, which I was like over the moon about. They give you a little piece of paper that tells you, this is what you know. This is what you want to get people like blackmail, or you've got something you want to share with someone. You've got beef with somebody. And then halfway through the night, someone dies. Mm-hmm. And then the second half of the night, everyone gets another little piece of paper that says, here's some more stuff you know. Here's some more motivations. Maybe even here's a piece of evidence that you have. Maybe you have the knife. Maybe you have a torn up contract for something. And everybody votes, and people get to do a vote for who they think is the murderer, best performance, best costume. We give out awards, the whole thing.
Do you make a production about the death? Like, do the lights go out, come back on, and then somebody's on the ground?
We had somebody one year who was so intense. He said, can I fall down the stairs? And I said, if you want to.
I need you to sign this form.
He broke his thumb and ended up having to get surgery. And I'll tell you something. Shit. He said it was 100% worth it. It was the performance of a lifetime. But I had been doing these for a number of years, and people kept getting added to the group until we were like 35 people. And so literally they didn't make murder mysteries big enough with enough like player count. So we started adding in our own characters and adding in our own plot lines. And we keep our house somewhat Halloween decorated year round, but I would go all in on the theming, all in on the decorations. At a certain point, I decided, I'm just going to write my own from scratch. So I've written 2 from scratch. Each of them took about 8 months to do because it's a lot of work. I always say this. We don't do this because it's easy. We do this because we thought it was going to be easy. There was no greater example than this. I decided to write a murder mystery that was all Batman villains. And the Joker's throwing a party because he has Batman's identity hidden in a box. Mm-hmm. And halfway through the night, the Joker gets murdered and Batman's identity goes missing. And everyone's trying to figure out who killed the murderer and where the heck is Batman's identity. And I ended up trying to sell it to a company, and I got this close to signing it. They were like, we need to do one more playtest with all 30 people. They told me this on March 12th, 2020. For those keeping score at home, that was literally the day before we all went into lockdown.
Oh, God.
So they were like, we can't ever foresee a situation in which we feel confident making a game that requires 30 people to be in a room at once. So that died. But this year, just to give an example of how far out we go, this year I decided I was going to write a murder mystery that was a sequel to the Barbie movie, in which Alan has made everyone mad because not only can he fit into all of Ken's clothes, he can do all of Ken's jobs. And so he goes on a journey to try and sort of find himself and find a position in life, but he keeps accidentally giving other Kens existential crises. So he decides he wants to be a firefighter. And so firefighter Ken's with him. And he's like, okay, so like, are we going to save lives? We're going to put out fires. He's like, well, actually, the world's plastic. There's no such thing as fire here. And he's like, okay, so like your job is nothing. All right, never mind. And he like goes to lifeguard Ken. And lifeguard Ken's like, yeah, I save lives. He's like, oh, you go in the water a lot? He's like, no, the water's made of plastic. And so everyone gets mad and they end up killing Alan. Alan's the victim. And so everyone's trying to figure out who killed Alan. We went so hard on the Barbie decorations that my wife painted our entire fireplace mantle bright pink. It's still hot pink.
Nice.
We built from scratch a Mattel Barbie box, like a toy box for people to fit inside to take pictures. Again, didn't do it because it was easy. Did it because we thought it was going to be easy. We thought this was going to be like a 3-hour project. It turned into like a 2.5-week project. Every aspect of this, we bought one of those 13-foot skeletons from Home Depot.
That's on your Instagram, right?
It is. For Barbie, we decided to bling her all out. So she became a giant, like, monolith obelisk Barbie. Every aspect of our house, we were like, how do we change this to be Barbie themed? And so it was a lot of fun. But yeah, it's the thing that I look forward to most out of the entire year. We do it every year. I'm going to write more. I don't know if I'll ever have a chance to sell them. I don't know if I'll have a chance. I may eventually one day just like publish them all on my website for free and just say like, if you want it, here they are. Because I just don't know if there's a way to monetize on this. But I do want to share it because I think that they're a lot of fun. The nice thing about it is that it gets everybody to be a storyteller. No matter how reserved you may think you are, no matter how much you may think I'm not an actor, when you walk into that door and somebody tries to give you a hug, but they can't bend their elbows because they think they're a Barbie, there's no way that you can stay like shelled in. You are forced out of your box and you're like, oh, I'm in a comfort zone where I can go wild with this character. I'm country music singer Ken. Well, let's have a rootin' tootin' good time, you know? Everybody opens up, and whether people know each other or not, because we have wildly different groups of friends also that come in. We've got 35 people that show up. I've got people who know each other only by character names. And they're like, oh, I know Mr. Freeze from like 3 years ago. And I'm like, yeah, his name's actually Nate. But yes, he was Mr. Freeze. So the other nice thing about it is it's like the ultimate icebreaker because you have a reason. It's a party with a purpose. You have a reason to go up to a total stranger and be like, how dare you take my prince husband out into the woods, you know, or whatever the story is. We had somebody who legitimately slapped someone in the face. And then and we were like, and for a second, everyone was like, whoa. And then they were like, no, it's good. It's good. We talked about it. They talked about it before because they thought it would be really fun in the moment because that was something that was part of their characters. They were like, this would be really cool. And it was like, oh my gosh, you really slapped this dude like hard in the face. And so you get these really great moments from people. And these people didn't know each other before the night started. And by the end of the night, they were comfortable.
They had assaulted each other.
They were comfortable enough to assault each other in public and laugh about it. And so like, for me, I'm like, there's no better thing, right? I mean, yes, I write books. I make board games. For me, it's all the same thing. It's storytelling. It's all storytelling. And so I think that there's no better avenue for collaborative storytelling than throwing these murder mystery parties, these wacky, wild parties where everybody just throws their whole selves into it and you give them a space that's safe and open enough to say, I'm whatever wild character you put me as, and I'm going to turn that character to 11 because I want best performance. I want best character, even if I'm not an actor, even if I've never acted once before in my life. It's wonderful to see. I've never had a party where people have just stayed in the corner and been like, nah, I'm not into this. It's never happened.
Awesome. Well, Jon, it has been a pleasure talking with you.
It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for listening to me ramble for so long.
Oh, I wanted to hear all about the party. I swear to God. I was telling my wife about that. I was like, this guy, I'm interviewing him tomorrow. Let me tell you what he does for Halloween. She was like, that sounds amazing.
Well, if anybody else wants to get in on it, literally go to nightofmystery.com. They can get you started with the theme of what I'm doing. I've just taken it to a level that no sane person should. But if you go to that website, like they've got some unbelievably fantastic mysteries that will absolutely guarantee that you're going to have a great time, whether it's a party of 8 people or 30 people. It's just a wonderful way to bring people together. Like I say, it's a party with a purpose. What more do you want? Like, what more could you get with getting people together, right?
Absolutely. Well, in addition to that, as we bring the show to a close, is there anything you'd like to plug or let your readers know about?
Yeah. So Everything is Temporary is out now. I know the cover looks like it's a Christmas book. I promise you, it is a book you can read year round. Slashtag, I have the prequel to that coming out, Try Not to Die on Slashtag. That's coming out very soon. I don't have a hard date on it yet. But yes, I would like to say, I also have a third novel. It's called The Island Mother. If you've already heard of me and read Everything is Temporary and Slashtag, and you're thinking, I've read both of Jon Cohn's books, I got good news for you. There's one more right now that you can read.
Award-winning.
And it's award-winning. So. But yeah, all my book, if you like one of my books, all my books are very similar in a sense of they're all told deeply within the character's perspective. It's all about the character for me. So, I don't write too overly gory. I'm not an extreme horror author. I also don't know if I would fit into the cozy horror. I think I'm somewhere in between. But yeah, that's what I got out right now. I've got some board games if you like board games. You can find all of my stuff at www.joncohnauthor.com. You can also order autographed books from me from there as well. And I got a bunch of stickers. People love stickers. I love making stickers. Whenever anybody buys a book from me, I'm like, here's like 8 stickers that I'm going to stick in the book too. So if you like stickers, you're going to get a bunch of them if you buy an autographed copy on my website.
All right. All right. Well, listeners at home, all links are in the description. And Jon, thank you again for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It was a blast.
And thank you to everyone that tuned in. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Be sure to tune in next Tuesday when I will be joined by a writer who has taken the genre of the mob crime thriller and added splatterpunk depravity. So until then, stay healthy, stay sane, and as always, thank you for listening. See you next time.
Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. Who cares? You know I won't admit it. If your girl has gotten it, she gotta scratch it. But I ain't no snitch, no, I ain't no snitch. Maybe I would, maybe I wouldn't. I swear either way, you'll never know it. Go ahead and ask, but I ain't talking. Cause I ain't no snitch, no, I ain't no snitch. I'm a klepto, not a psycho. Let's go. Prove it. Think that I'm a liar, then prove it. Think that I'm a thief, then do it. Go ahead, call the Scully, go ahead, call the Scully. You ain't finding nothing on me. Go prove it. Go ahead, check my phone, yeah, do it. Check the skellies in my closet, go through it. Go ahead, call the Scully, go ahead, call the Scully. You ain't finding nothing on me. Maybe I should, maybe I shouldn't. But you ain't my conscience, so screw it. If I feel like it, you know I gotta do it. You know I can't help it, you know I can't help it. Gold and silver give me weak knees. It ain't nothing around my neck unless I can't breathe. When you gonna learn it, just stop asking me. Cause I ain't no snitch, I ain't no snitch. I'm a klepto, not a psycho. Prove it. Think that I'm a liar, then prove it. Think that I'm a thief, then do it. Go ahead, call the Scully, go ahead, call the Scully. You ain't finding nothing on me. Go prove it. Go ahead, check my phone, yeah, do it. Check the skellies in my closet, go through it. Go ahead, call the Scully, go ahead, call the Scully. You ain't finding nothing on me. Some call me a bandit, that they say it's a bad habit. But one thing that they can never say, I'll be is red-handed. Some call it a blessing, others say that it's a curse. You can tell me which is which, I think the line's a little blurred. How could you accuse me? I'm just a lady. I've never done a thing wrong in my life. How could you blame me, little old me? Do you see any deceit in my eyes? Would I lie? I'm a klepto, not a psycho. Prove it. Think that I'm a liar, then prove it. Think that I'm a thief, then do it. Go ahead, call the Scully, go ahead, call the Scully. You ain't finding nothing on me. Go prove it. Go ahead, check my phone, yeah, do it. Check the skellies in my closet, go through it. Go ahead, call the Scully, go ahead, call the Scully. You ain't finding nothing on me. Some call me a bandit, that they say it's a bad habit. But one thing that they can never say, I'll be is red-handed. Some call it a blessing, others say that it's a curse. You can tell me which is which, I think the line's a little blurred. I'm a klepto, not a psycho.